Oh, well, Dean didn't come, but it was his birthday recently too. So happy birthday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I'll be recording this, and so don't say anything embarrassing. And let's start with the Hardmet. Okay? Anun hor yevortvo yevokfuin survo. Hardmet vor hedgineses. Surp yeritzi anun ko. Yegeste arkaychun ko. Yeritzi gam ko. Vorbes hedgines evergri. Es hatsmer hanabazor durmez aysor. Եվ մեզ զբարդիս մեր, որպես եւ մենք թողում կմերոց պարտաբանած։ Եվ մի դանիրես մեզի փորձություն, ապրգյազ մեզի չարեն։ Զիկոյի արքայություն եւ զորություն եւ փառք Kalayjian's. Amen. Okay, so we're in Corinthians. This time we're in chapter 8, but just a brief review of last time. We finished up, chapter 7 was about divorce and marriage and relations of different types, including slave, free, etc. And Paul goes through many different cases to talk about, you know, how we should behave in these situations. And we saw that with regard to marriage, this new, for the Corinthians at least, religion, Christianity, was very different from the pagan and Judaic customs that they saw, that they were used to when it came to attitudes towards women and marriage. The playing field is much more equal. There's much more mutual sacrifice and attention. Women are not property anymore, and that's something that was a huge change for the culture and a very big contribution to of Christianity to the Western world there, and probably to the East too. I haven't studied it, but in the context of talking about marriage and whether people should get married and what they should do if they're about to get married, or if they've been married and are no longer married, Paul brings a certain focus to people's lives, and he says in one sentence, he says, time is short, and this world, this in its present form, is passing away. And in that one sentence, he summarized and crystallized a lot of his thoughts around the topic that he was talking about, that we should really make sure that our focus is on the eternal and not on the things that can distract us from focusing on God and from concentrating on his will. All right? So we should be living with eternity in our minds and hearts. Now, in this chapter, we're going to talk about another controversy that's plaguing Christianity, and John Barbarian is calling me. Hold on a second. John? Hello? Hey. Yes. Yeah. I thought I did. Okay, here you go. All right. Yeah. All right, I didn't let John in. Hi, Dean. Dean, for some reason, you don't need an invitation, but I need to be able to let John into the Bible study. And by the way, we said happy birthday to you before you joined. So, John, are you in now? Yes, I see it.
Yes.
Jay. Okay, very good. Yeah. So, in this chapter, we're going to talk about another controversy that's happening in the Corinthian church, and it revolves around food and what we eat and how we eat. All right, and this is rather apropos because we're about to start Lent. All right, and that's a period in our church where we fast before Easter, and I was just reading. I'm going to admit. Oh, you know what, John? I see why I didn't admit you last time. Pare valvart. Gam
Բարև
yevarak.
Բարև Yes, մենակ ես։
Okay, all right. So I was reading Alexander Schmemann, who's an Orthodox theologian. He wrote a really great book called The Life of the World. And he was talking about fasting and food, and I thought this was a good quote to prepare us for Lent. He says, our appetites have been misdirected, leading us to believe that there is a contradiction between God's glory and our own happiness. that we cannot submit our lives to God and still have what we really want. The original sin, the quote-unquote original sin, is not primarily that man has disobeyed God. The sin is that he ceased to be hungry for God and him alone, for God alone. And I thought that was a good way to prepare ourselves for this Lenten fast, where we're trying to rein in our own appetites and focus in on God. So, with that, let's start reading the chapter. It's a short chapter, for 1 Corinthians chapter 8. So we're just going to read it all through. And remember, as we usually do, I want us to think as if we're part of the conversation. So I want us to try to also interpolate what the Corinthians had talked to Paul about regarding this topic, as Paul is answering their concerns, or the letter that we don't have in front of us, but that they must have communicated to Paul somehow. Try to figure out where they were coming from and what concern they expressed to Paul, so that we can read Paul's answer and be part of the conversation that way. So who would like to read the first 7, like the left side of the column here, and then we'll go and read the right side separately. Who would like to read 1 through 7?
I will.
By the way, what's intake Nairi?
Oh, it's for counseling intake. I'm on my work
Okay.
work email.
Oh, good. Good. We could bring our problems to you then.
After the study.
Okay.
Now, concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing, yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other God but one. For even if there are so-called idols, so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we are for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge, for some, with consciousness of the idol, until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled.
Okay. And from 8 to 13.
Are you looking for a volunteer?
I am.
Okay, well, I will be the one.
Very good.
All right. But food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? Oh, that sounds complicated. And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. Oh, and because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble.
Okay. So, should we go over this? What is the problem here that the Corinthians are wrestling with? All right. What is Paul? What question did the Corinthians pose that Paul is trying to answer or clarify?
Alright, something concerning the eating of things.
Mhm.
I don't know what he means by offered to idols.
Oh, okay. Does anyone know what that means? It's okay. So, this is important for us to understand then. So that we
Is that the
understand this passage.
sacrifice?
It is. It's a sacrifice.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
remember, we're in the Greek city of Corinth, or I guess it's a Greek city controlled by Rome, occupied by many different peoples, and the Romans and the Greeks, they have many gods, and to worship these gods, to appease them, just 1 second while I send the invitation to Edita. Off, Edita.
Zaven, you need an administrator. At least a co-host.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know why that she's not on. I mean, she does get the emails, but I'm used to being her tech.
Yeah.
Okay, Ed.
Sorry. Ինչու ես ինձ միշտ մոռանում։
Չեմ մոռանում, Edita. Միասա որ մոռանում։ Okay, where are we here? Oh, so I was talking about idols. So they were sacrificing food to idols, and actually, almost everything that was served in the marketplace, much of it could have been food that was sacrificed to an idol. Part of it was eaten by the priest. Part of it was eaten by the people doing the sacrifice, and some of it might have ended up in the market for other people to come and eat. And so it was the social milieu. It was the practice. It was the environment that really challenged the Christians in Corinth, especially people who were careful about eating food sacrificed to idols. And we're going to get into why or why not they should be careful. But for people who were careful, who were concerned about that, it was a difficult proposition, because this was happening a lot, and you might be invited to a wedding or something, some event where there was food sacrificed by idols, and there's an intense social pressure for you to eat this food. And aside from that, like I said, there's the food in the markets, and you don't even know if they've been sacrificed to idols or not. So there's a concern here about eating food sacrificed to idols. All right, that's the idea there. Dean has raised his hand.
Oh, he's muted.
And we can't hear you.
Yeah, you're muted.
Oh no. Okay. Well, you can try logging out and back in. That's always a good. You can leave the house and come back in, or I don't know. Okay, we'll continue. So, Hasvik, that's kind of the background here. There's the there were many cults and many gods, and every celebration there would be a sacrifice, and there was a legitimate concern for whether or not, or how, or under what circumstances a Christian might participate in the eating of the food that was sacrificed to an idol.
What would be wrong? Okay, just because it was sacrificed to an idol, they were not supposed to touch it, technically, I guess.
Well, so what does it say here in Paul's
that
letter?
there is only one God. Okay,
so on the one hand, Paul says, look, what's an idol? An idol is nothing. But on the other hand, there's some tension here because of how some people look at that food, or how some people are concerned about participating in the ceremony that was, through which that food was sacrificed. Do they get somehow? Are they participating in that idolatry? is this something that is going to be spiritually affect them somehow? And this is what the problem is for the Corinthians. All right, and in some ways there's a kind of two ways that we could pose the question here. One is, can I eat food that's sacrificed to idols? And he talks about that. But I think there's another angle to the question where the Corinthians might actually be asking something else. Why can't we eat food sacrificed to idols? Right?
Okay.
And there's this discussion about knowledge and love and what happens when you're eating food in front of someone who might be more sensitive to you. And this is what Paul is getting into here. All right. But as much as this was a topic for the Corinthians, we should know that Jesus made pronouncements on food, and the early church also wrestled with this question very, very early on. Yes, that's exactly what we're gonna get into, John. So first, let's look at what Jesus said. And this was in response to, well, does anyone remember the context to this? Which when Jesus said, "It's not the things that go into the mouth." Sorry, it should be mouth. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles the man, but the things which come out of it. Does anyone remember what was going on there? Actually, it's escaped my memory too.
Yes, I think he's talking about he was being criticized and his disciples for not washing their hands. Isn't that it? Not following the tradition of the elders by washing their hands before they ate?
It's got to be connected with the Hebrew practices of eating, right? And Gohar is agreeing with you. But certainly what this tells us is there were a lot, and we know from the Old Testament, there are a lot of restrictions on what to eat and how to eat, right? Among the Jews. And Jesus is saying now, look, what makes you good and righteous is not what you put into your mouth and how you put it into your mouth, but it's what comes out of your mouth, what comes out of your heart, and this is where often we hear that's where God is looking inside us into the heart. All right. Certainly how we behave is important, but in this case, eating the wrong food, Jesus is saying here, is not going to defile you. All right. But there's more to the story than this. Because like I said, early in the church, there was a major issue that was dividing even the apostles, because Paul and Barnabas, they got into an argument with some brothers in the church who were saying that unless you could keep all of the commands of Moses and customs of Moses, you can't be saved. Unless you become a Jew, effectively, you can't become a Christian and be saved. And this argument became very sharp, and they had to go to Jerusalem, where the major figures of the early Christian church, the apostles, especially James at this point, were sitting and were deciding these questions, and were discussing and figuring out how Christians should behave with regard to these questions. So Paul and Barnabas go to James, and Peter wasn't there. Otherwise, he probably would have been the one that they asked. But he was being persecuted and arrested, and he broke out of jail. Anyway, they wanted to kill him, so he was not in Jerusalem at the time. So James says this, and this is in this roughly the same area of Acts, but he says it two different times. Mostly the same advice or the same commandment. He says, therefore, or let's have someone read it. Go ahead. Can you read it, please? Just this first one, if your mic is working. That's right, Sevan and Kerry Topchan. This was the same argument with circumcision. All right, well, I'll read it. James says, therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. And later on, again in Acts, he says, kind of repeats the same advice. He says, concerning Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. Same things that he wrote in 2 different times. So, the advice that went out from Jerusalem by James and by the apostles, and Paul and Barnabas were there too, was that people should stay away from meat sacrificed to idols. All right? And as well as fornication and these other things. Okay? Now, undoubtedly, Paul, who was there, must have communicated this to the Corinthians. All right? But at the same time, the Corinthians knew this, that it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you. Okay? So, can you see this question forming in the Corinthians' minds? Well, on the one hand, I know that eating this food is something I should abstain from. It's not good, and the church has seen or has said that it's not good for us new Christians to eat this. But on the other hand, we're free from from the old ways of Moses, from the 600 plus commandments of the Old Testament or of the Torah, and we're free in Christ. We have a new way of interacting with God. It's much more personal. It's not based on a set of laws. And how do I reconcile now this freedom with this restriction? And here's where Paul, again, with the Corinthians, who think that they're very smart, and like I said before, it's likely that they were thinking in their minds, well, come on, why can't I eat this idol food? Because everyone knows, we all know that there's only God. This idol food is, they just sacrifice it to nothing. It means nothing. Why can't I eat it? All right? And this is where Paul gets into the very fine line between knowledge and wisdom. Okay, what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Here's a funny quote I saw. Knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing that it'd be terrible in a fruit salad.
It's a good example.
It's a good example. But what is the difference between knowledge and wisdom?
Well, the Bible says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's what it says.
Okay.
And that means,
yes,
that implies action.
Could you?
Wisdom implies action. Right?
Okay.
Knowing something's not good enough, right? But knowing that if I cross the street and I get hit by a car, I'm going to die. That's great. But wisdom is not crossing the street.
So wisdom is applying your knowledge.
Yeah.
That's one way of doing it, and people have said that who was it, Einstein, or so some famous person said something like, wisdom, knowledge is organized. Sorry, that was about science. Science is organized knowledge, but wisdom is organized life. Sorry, related, but not the same thing. So, do we agree wisdom is applied?
Yeah, it's knowing how to use knowledge. Knowledge is almost like information.
Yeah.
But yeah, wisdom is whether it's action or whether it's something more spiritual or character. It's just knowing how to apply all this information, knowledge, everything you have. What to do with it, maybe.
Okay. All right. That's too general, though, I would say. Because I don't know. Let's take an example. Someone, a pagan might be wise in knowing how to apply knowledge, in that sense,
Okay.
or an atheist in a modern day sense.
But not ultimately, right? Because the pagan will not understand how to live correctly, right? So the Christian, the person who has faith, who knows God, who fears God, knows how the wise way to act in all things, whereas the pagan will not know that.
So, when you said correctly, you brought in basically a compass to show what wise behavior, in which direction wise behavior would go.
Correct.
What wise behavior would look like. And,
Correct.
And with the addition of that, I would say, okay, I would agree. Wisdom is knowing how to behave righteously. Wisdom is knowing how to apply knowledge with love. It's not just the application, but it's a certain way of applying. Would you agree?
No, I think I'm going to contest you.
Okay.
Why is it wisdom applying? Why is it wisdom living righteously?
Oh, I wouldn't say
righteously.
that it's not. Sorry, go ahead.
Because otherwise, if you know how to live righteously but don't do it, are you wise?
No, I'm saying that. I'm saying wisdom is applied knowledge, but it's applied with love. It's applied with righteousness.
Yes,
Towards righteousness, perhaps you should say.
Okay.
Right? Because just applied knowledge is again too general. Wisdom, a scientist can be wise because he can apply knowledge and build a electric vehicle or something like that. Right. So, but here's a question we want to ask about wisdom and knowledge. If you have knowledge without wisdom, what can be the repercussions there?
Can I answer?
Who's that? Yervan.
That-
Yes,
Hello.
go ahead.
How are you?
Good.
Hello, how is everyone?
We're well.
Good.
Looks like you're back in the Shire. All right.
I'm in the Shire again. So, there's this saying that I'm going to butcher, but it's if you give someone an education without any moral teaching, you're basically building a weapon against mankind. Right. So, I'm just trying to build off of what you and John were saying. It seems wisdom at its heart at its most essence comes from the heart, because the heart, what you feel. You ask any chess master, grandmaster, how they think about their moves in chess, and they're like, we really don't think about them. The gross masters always, they just feel through things. And the analogy I'm bringing up here is about, and many times in my life, I've had the knowledge, but I didn't know how to apply it. And I looked to my heart and my conscience to understand how things work and how I should apply that knowledge. And sometimes I had no idea what to decide. And that's where I think the Bible comes in and the love for God, because God is wisdom. And if you follow what's written in the Bible and the direction there, it gives you a North Star to how your heart is supposed to feel and how you're supposed to use that knowledge that you've accumulated through your life to make the right decisions at the right time, God willing.
So, Yervant, thank you for that, because that is very close to what Paul says here in verses 1 through 3. All right, let's just quickly go through 1 through 3 again here. He says, concerning idols, we all have knowledge, right? Paul almost acts as if knowledge is easy to come by, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he says knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. What is edifies?
Makes holy?
Build up.
It builds up,
Mm-hmm.
teaches, it
Encourage.
encourages. if anyone thinks he knows anything, he doesn't know anything yet the way he should. And this reminds me of a Chinese saying. I won't get into it now. Anyway, Paul is saying knowledge now is not enough. Knowledge is not enough. What completes knowledge? What turns it into wisdom? Sorry. If anyone loves God, all right, and this is where your knowledge becomes something that is not just puffing you up anymore. If anyone loves God, there's a missing thing here. He becomes wise. And not only that, this one is known by him. All right. And in fact, I think he skipped this. He wants to complete what he's saying up here, but he doesn't really have to. If you love God, that means that your wisdom, your knowledge becomes that wisdom that edifies, that builds, that encourages. All right. But not only that, when you love God, you are known by him. Now, doesn't God know us already pretty well? What does that mean, we're known by him? I always love when reading the Bible, looking at these phrases that are too obvious and trying to understand what's really happening, what's being said here. Of course God knows us.
Known by him.
Does this remind you of or anyone of a time where Jesus turned to people around him, and to some people he said, "I don't know you," and to other people he said, "You will be with me in paradise." So here's what I think Paul is getting at here. John Barbarian raised his hand.
Oftentimes in the Bible, when it talks about knowing something, it's not just knowledge in your head, but it's shared experience. Okay? So, for example, when Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac and he was going to go through with it, I think God at the end tells him, "But now I know." Okay? Because it was demonstrated. Abraham's faith was demonstrated. There was an experience there. It just wasn't something in someone's head. And I think there's that second meaning to the word "to know" in the Bible. I think the Hebrew. Well, anyway. So I think that's what's going on here. If anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Zaven?
Yes, we can go ahead. Go for it.
I have problems with my microphone. Sorry. So I think known by God means accepted, acknowledged. One belongs to God, not just mere knowledge of.
Yes, and this is where I was heading to, because I remember the parable. Well, it wasn't really a parable. Jesus was saying there's going to be a time towards the end of the world where people are going to come to me and say, "Lord, didn't we do miracles in your name and blah blah blah?" But he's going to turn to them and say, "I don't know you." And why didn't he know those people?
Because they didn't actually trust him.
They didn't trust him?
There wasn't a relationship there.
There wasn't a relationship? And how is that relationship supposed to have been expressed?
By works.
By works of
Righteousness.
love by works of love to their fellow people, to the people that that asked them for food, to the people who they came across and who were needy, who were fallen, who needed their help. All right, the people who, for whom the love that person showed could have been edifying. And this is what God, this is how we are, like Gohar said, in God, in a way. When we are known by Him, we're part of His family. We're in His camp. We're part of His kingdom. If anyone loves God, and this is the beginning of wisdom, as John said in Proverbs, and as our forefathers translated the first part of in the first letters of the Armenian alphabet, talking about how the word of God is what is for teaching and for wisdom and for, what was it? Oh boy, who remembers the first translation from the Bible by Mesrop? Edita, where's Edita?
Janachel?
Janachel Imastuni of Schradas. Yeah.
That's it.
Right. And when we Janachel Zimastutun, we are Janachvads Zimastyan Gomits. When we know the wisdom, we are known by that wisdom too. Okay, and so now Paul is setting up the Corinthians for some advice. All right? He says, yeah, you guys think you know everything, but what you don't know is how to apply what you know in a certain way, with love, with the edification of the people around you, of your brothers and sisters. All right? And here's where he starts to get into where they're going wrong. All right? So, from 4 to 6, who wants to read this part? Zaven and Carrie. Someone wants to read there?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hey, Zaven.
Hey. Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom all are things, and through whom we live.
Great. So this is the basic knowledge that even the Corinthians have. Right? The Corinthians know, and presumably this is why they're talking to Paul, like, why can't we eat these idols? Because it's just a so-called God. It's not a real God. And we shouldn't have any qualms about eating this food that's given to these pagan gods. They're behind us. We're past it. It doesn't affect us. All right. But here also Paul is reminding them who they are. All right. We are for God, and we live through Jesus Christ. And this is going to be very important later on when he talks about how we should behave towards people with a little bit of a weak conscience. All right. I'm so glad you talked about conscience, Yervan, because this verse 7 is all about conscience. What is conscience? What is conscience? In the Christian worldview, what is conscience?
A little voice that tells you that you're going to do wrong.
That you're going to do wrong? And then,
right.
Okay. So it's an internal moral compass?
Yes.
You might say? Okay. Do you guys agree with that definition? It's hard to disagree with the edit scheme. All right. What is conscience? So Zaven and Carrie, you want to add something to that?
Well, I was just going to say that ultimately this is the goal of the Christian, right? Is to ultimately have the conscience and the mind of God, right? The theosis to become like God. So it can be part of the journey of becoming like God, similar to like our nous, for example, right? Our way that we connect with Him at a soul level.
Okay, so part of our Christian journey is shaping this conscience to be more and more like God, which means that our conscience, if it gives us a certain direction, it may not be the right direction. Is that the case? Can our conscience be wrong?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so too.
We're not perfect.
I think so too. We're not perfect. All right, let's look at a couple of places where Paul talks about conscience. Okay, it is an important concept in our lives. All right. For one thing, we know that there is something about about how God created the universe and His fingerprint in creation that is written on our hearts that shows up in our conscience. There's something in our conscience that is naturally sort of God directed. So in Romans he says they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. And their conflicting thoughts accuse and even excuse them. In other words, sometimes your conscience is going to tell you, oh, I shouldn't do this, or maybe I can do this. All right? So conscience, there's something of God in our conscience. All right? And Paul writes here as well, the aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and good conscience and a sincere faith. All right? If there's a good conscience, there could also be a bad conscience. If there's a pure heart, there could be an impure heart or an insincere faith. So conscience is something that God gave us. It's a piece of equipment that helps us to do good, but does it always perfectly tell us what the good is in every case? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Mom.
If you don't listen to your conscience, little by little it erodes. The voice gets smaller and smaller, and you cannot hear anything from your conscience after a while. If it finds that you are not heeding the advice of your conscience.
Okay. So you're saying that but conscience will always give you good advice? But if you're not heeding it, well, what are you doing to your conscience?
I use the word erodes. It starts getting it's not as sharp as it used to be in the beginning.
Dulled?
Yeah.
Paul calls it searing the conscience, like burning it and making it less, I don't know, less flexible, less true, right? Yervant?
This is I don't have I just have a comment. It's almost every day of our lives. I would assume I almost every day of my life, I assume that people talk to me, and there's a whole lot of rationalization that goes around in people's minds. So if I'm at the bar and I'm talking to someone will say in a bold voice that this is right. For example, if no one cares about me, why should I care about them? Right, the world is this way, and all of this type of stuff, these type of arguments, I think we've listened to all our lives, and then you're like, hey, that kind of does make sense. And depending on where you are in your life, you might take that as doctrine, and you might rationalize it to yourself, hey, this is my new conscience. And I hear it all the time, and constantly. People's mouths are talking things that just don't sit well with my heart, but sometimes they did. So what I'm trying to say is your conscience can lead you astray because you can rationalize, and if your own experiences in your life have led you to a certain conclusion, you can rationalize that conscience and pretend that it's wisdom. But at the end of the day, I don't know. This is what bothers me. I don't know whether I really knew the truth from day one, from the beginning, and I just rationalized things in my life. I don't know. But I do know that certain people, the way they express themselves, make me really think that they do have this innate ability to vocalize something. So they think something, they say something, and if that something is somewhat accepted, they take that to be
True.
True. Like they rationalize things that there's some people in the world that just when they speak something and it's accepted or believe that it's accepted, they make it part of their conscience. And so all I'm trying to say is your conscience can lead you astray, and you shouldn't rely on that, and therefore the wisdom of God, as it's stated several times in the Bible, is you always have a North Star where you can look to say, hey, is it jiving with what's written? And if it's not jiving with what's written, maybe I should reevaluate.
Yeah. So here's what I'm hearing from you and from Yeretzkin, a little bit of a different perspective on what conscience is. I think in Yeretzkin's mind, conscience always points you in the right direction. And what happens to people when they ignore their conscience or they allow other advice to get in the way of listening to their conscience is that they become deaf to that good inner voice, right? And from Yervant, what I get from you is that our conscience is our own in a sense, in the sense that it is under it's our responsibility to always keep it pointed in the right direction, and other people might come in and misdirect it or change the guidance of our compass in certain ways, and our conscience can get us off course. Right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and especially in this generation where you hear about like young people, I still don't quite understand how this is, but this is my truth. I'm living my truth, right? And you hear all of this stuff, and you're like, how did you get to this point? Is in my mind is like, how did you get to this point? It must have been through a lot of hurt feelings because I thought the truth was the truth.
Alvart, you raised your hand.
Ես ուզում եմ հասկանամ conscience-ը գիտակցությունն է, չէ?
It's typical conscience խիղճ
Խիղճ։ Օ,
Alvar, совесть это conscience.
Conscience խիղճ եղավ։
Հա, եւ հարց ենք տալիս, եթե այդ խիղճը միշտ մեզ ճիշտ է ուղում, թե կարող է շեղվի։ Ինչ-որ պայման։
Հա, մնացածը հասկանում, բայց այսինքն գիտակցություն այդ conscious unconscious այդ նույն ձևով է գրվում։
No.
Okay.
There is an N missing in the second one.
No, there's conscious. Did I spell that correctly? There's conscience, which is the chirch, and conscious, which is ushk, artun.
You're good with both. They're both
good.
It's a tricky word to spell.
Yeah.
It has tricky spelling.
What happened here? Okay. So, so we're wrestling with what the conscience is, but here's something that Paul says. All right, that might help us figure out what's going on here. And this is again. To a different church, but on the same topic of eating food to idols. He says, the man who doubts is condemned if he eats. The man who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith. And everything that does not come from faith is sin. what does that say about our conscience? Maybe nothing. Maybe what does it say about faith? No, I think it does say something about conscience. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm having trouble again. So to me, conscience is a conscience is shaped based on our moral values and worldviews, right? But I think in a perfect creation that God intended, and He gave us this conscience as a tablet where He would write the knowledge, and we would acquire that perfect knowledge, and the conscience and God's wisdom and knowledge would synchronize, and we would live in a perfect consciousness through our lives. So I think that's because consciousness by itself is not enough. We need to have the wisdom and knowledge of God to live a perfectly sensitive, living in a perfect consciousness. So, and what Paul is saying here is that if your consciousness prompts you that this may be wrong, but you go ahead and do that anyway, you're sinning. If I don't know that, if I don't recognize idols and I don't believe in idols, and I just pick up that piece of meat and eat it, and I don't know that it has been sacrificed, and I don't know what idol is, I just eat it as a piece of meat, I don't sin. But if I know that it has been sacrificed to demons, which is any other, every idol is a demon, I know it and I knowingly eat it, that's a sin. I think that's what he's trying to say. So knowing that is wrong and doing it is a sin.
Do you guys agree with this interpretation?
Yes.
And she's unanimous in that. I agree too. Which gives this verse 7 an interesting interpretation. What's happening here? Paul is now getting to the matter where there are some people who, like Ohar said, have no problem eating idol food sacrificed to idols, because they know that it's not idol is not God. There's no problem with that. But there are some people with consciousness of the idol. They understand that it's an idol that the food has been sacrificed to, and they eat it as a thing offered to an idol. And their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Now, here's a case where we know a person eating this food would not be committing a sin, if they understood that this food is just any other food. It just happens to have come through a different route to the plate in front of them, right? Eating that food itself is not a sin. In this case, the sin that occurred, or the sin that may occur, all right, in this atmosphere of knowledge without love, the sin that may occur is that someone who doesn't understand this knowledge that there is only God and not idols might eat the food and in their own way participate in that sacrifice to the idol. And they do eat food that is sacrificed to an idol in their minds, in their conscience. And that is defiling. That defiles them. Food, God doesn't care about food. It doesn't commend us to God, and it's not a problem if we eat it. But how we eat it can be a big problem. How we eat it, according to Paul, if we're eating it not from faith, then we're eating it in sin. We're eating it against our conscience. We're eating it against that advice inside us that says you shouldn't eat food to idols. And this is where the weakness of the person, it's not a weakness of their conscience necessarily, it's a weakness of them standing up to the people around them in their own church who are doing this freely and who are doing this almost brazenly, because they know, hey, they're saying to themselves, hey, I'm free. I don't have to worry about this food being sacrificed to an idol. I'm beyond that. But what they don't understand is that their knowledge causing pride is leading their brethren to do something that is against their own conscience, is against their own faith and their own understanding. Oh, 2 hands raised. Go hot first.
I have a question actually.
Yeah.
I have had problems with that. I was invited a couple of times also in Armenia for matach, and I did not eat it because, quite frankly, I don't think that it was a Christian tradition, and I didn't really know who we're sacrificing that lamb to. Is it a pagan tradition? And if it's a pagan tradition, then we're not sacrificing it to God. And if we're sacrificing it to God, does God need this kind of sacrifice? So I have a problem with that.
What was the last part of the question? If it's not a sacrifice to God, do we need to do that sacrifice?
And if they say they sacrifice it to God, does God accept sacrifices like this? And do we need to do that? Because Christ was the ultimate sacrifice, right?
Okay. Madach, what's the story behind Madach?
I thought it's a pagan tradition that kind of trickled, at least in Armenia, into Christianity, and people kept it. But yeah, it never was clear to me. But it's, I think, one of many traditions that slowly kind of trickled and stayed.
It does seem pretty pagan, right? when people sacrifice a chicken or a lamb or something. Edita, what's the story? Madari Babatuni Incha.
So, մատաղը մեր եկեղեցու մեջ դա մոտեցրու աղը։ Աղի օրնությունն է, երբ որ այդ աղքատների կերակուր են պատրաստում, մատաղ հենց այդ է կոչվում, որ աղքատած կերակուր, երբ որ ինչ որ բանի համար զոհաբերություն ես անում, եւ տանում բաժանում ես ուրիշներին աղքատների համար, տվյալ մարդու հոգու հանգստության համար, կամ չգիտեմ, առողջության համար եւ այլն։ Այդ է մատաղի խորհուրդը։ Ուրիշների բան չկա մեջը։ Ուղղակի մեր երկրում մատաղը սխալ են հասկանում, մատաղը իրանք անում են, հետո նստում են ուտում խմում են, բան են անում, մտածում են, որ մատաղ արեցին, բայց դա մատաղ չի։ Մատաղը հետո տանում ես տնից դուրս եւ զոհաբերում ես ուրիշների համար, աղքատներին ես բաժանում, հետա։ Եվ մատաղը կարա ոչ միայն միս լինի, նաեւ կարա հագուստ լինի, կարա կերակուր լինի, ցանկացած բան։
Բայց մեծամասամբ դա միս է, որ
Yeah, բայց կարա նաև ասում եմ միս չլինի, ցանկացած բան կարա մատաղ լինի։ Նայած մատո աղը, մոտեցրու աղը, հենց այդ աղի օրնությունն է, որ կենթանին կամ տվյալ կերակուրը էփվում է դրանով օրտնված։
Yeah, Սևանը գրեց ոնց որ հին գդագարանի մեջ մարդիկ իրենց առաջին փերքը կամ բդուղները կամ չգիտեմ ամենալավ ոչխարները փերում էին որպեսի օրտնվեր եւ դա պիտի դրվեր ուրիշներին չէ իրենք իրենց համար չէին դա փերում որպեսի հետո ստանան
դա աստծո համար էր դա տարբեր է հին կտակարանի այդ զոհաբերությունը աստծո համար էր իրանք իրանց բերքի լավագույն մասը տալիս էին աստծուն այդ լրիվ ուրիշ է մատաղը լրիվ քրիստոնեական խորհուրդ ունի շատ քրիստոնեական է բայց աղքատների համար է ոչ թե այս հիմա որ մարդիկ իրար ուտում խմում են էդի չի մատաղը ուղղակի մարդկանց մեջ սխալ հասկացողություն է թե չէ մատաղը շատ լավ բան է
Okay, Yervant, you had a hand raised and then John had a comment.
So I think
I think the hard part for me when I read this is what is the context of the conversation? Is the context of the conversation, hey, we sat down and sacrificed to Zeus.
Yes, it could be.
Now we're eating meals sacrificed to Zeus.
Yes, it could very well have been in Corinth. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in Corinth, right? If that was the case, is Paul saying that's okay as long as you know who you are and you believe in God? If that's okay, is that I'm just trying to understand what Paul is saying, and then I'll come up with an opinion. But I'm just trying to understand what he's saying, right? Because that matters a whole lot, right?
Sure. Well, what is he? What is
that's
he
the
saying?
question I'm asking.
What is? Yeah, and I want to turn it to everyone here because in many different parts of what we just in the conversation about this topic, the apostles, James, Paul and Barnabas being there also agreed, and Paul writes to the Romans also that eating idol food is something that we should avoid, should abstain from. Yet we should be able to eat everything. This is the conflict here. This is the challenge that the Corinthians are trying to figure out, and we want to understand too. So where should we land on this?
I think it's time and place with everything, right? That's what I mean. I'm not gonna eat a lamb or whatever is sacrificed to Zeus in this time and day. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that to any god that's not God. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to sit down at a table and eat. But I think what's more important in our time and day is what are the idols of our time and day?
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Right? Is it beer? Is it oldie? Is it do we sit down at those tables? And that I think hits upon the point of back, if you go back 2,000 years ago, Paul is trying to maybe cut a middle ground between, hey, you cannot just, maybe what Paul is saying is you cannot just remove yourself from mankind and all your human interactions, right? You have to be a beacon of Christianity, but there's a way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what he's saying. I don't know, but that might be something that is worthwhile talking about, rather than talking about sitting down and eating a matach for Zeus, because no one does that anymore.
Well, we do have to understand what matach means, and for some people, it could be as far off as that. For I would agree with Kohar. For many people in Hayastan who bring matach to the church, it might as well be sacrificed to Zeus. Because
that's just pure ignorance, though. That's just from pure ignorance. And there's a lot of Armenians that believe they're Christians and they put little trinkets around their house, but they don't know the first thing about it.
No, that's a good point. John, you had a hand raised?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, what do you think you're achieving by your sacrifice? Because if you think you're going to make God love you better, or you're going to somehow pay for your sin, then you're a heretic, because we know that Christ was the only sufficient sacrifice for sin. Right? So if that's the attitude that you have when you're eating madach, or if you're the Corinthians back in their day, then that would be a sin, right? Because only Christ was able to die and be a sufficient sacrifice for our sins, right? I thought the passage, though, is more about something else. I thought the passage is really about loving your brother over, or sister, over, the pleasure of eating meat. Because if what you're doing, which is perfectly fine, I think Paul says, but if it's causing your brother or your sister to sin, then you got a problem, because now you're putting your own belly over the well-being of your brother and sister. That's how I read the passage, and that ties in with what he was saying about love, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about loving your brother and sister is what I think this is about. And sacrificing your own desires to the well-being of your brother and your sister.
I like that approach.
Because if what I do will make my brother stumble, I'll never eat meat again. Right?
Who is this?
Well, yeah, but I think you would agree, right, that the problem with the Corinthians is not whether or not they understand idol food and their relationship with God and what the effectiveness of idol food. The problem is how they behave with this knowledge among people who might be a little bit less mature, let's say, in their faith. So people who have Gentiles who are just converted to Christianity, who are still very, very pressured by maybe their family, maybe their peers, certainly the society that they live in, to do things in a certain way, sacrifice to idols in a certain way, and perhaps there's a remnant of their paganness in that. And this is where I think Paul is trying to help the Corinthians understand that they have to be careful with how they behave, even having the ultimate knowledge about who God is and their relationship with God. And I think here, Paul really shows them how to do that. And of course, every question about how we should behave ultimately points to, well, what would Jesus do? How did Jesus behave? Here's the man who had ultimate freedom, who knew and could do anything he wanted, and everything that he did was right. But what he did was he perished for the weak brothers. Right? His example for everyone of sacrifice of himself, of his godly nature, all right, was for the salvation of the people, even those with a weak conscience, even those who are most susceptible to, well, the sheep. We're all his flock, all right. The sheep need guidance. The flock always needs guidance, and there are sheep that will go astray, and there are sheep that will follow the shepherd, and Christ is the one who goes after the stray sheep, right? And with that example in mind, he's trying to show the Corinthians that your knowledge that you think you know, you don't yet know as you ought to know. Because when you know as you ought to know, you'll know with love, like Christ, how to be compassionate, edifying, ultimately loving to the people around you, so that they will be built up, so that they'll see a good example and be more like Christ. Okay, and his approach here is ultimately leads up to looking at the example of Christ and making them realize that, hey, you guys, as much as you know, you should never forget that we are for the Father and we live through Jesus Christ. And that's what our lives should reflect. As much as our knowledge might try to convince us that we know differently, or we know better, or we know how to behave properly in some cases, in this case, for example. All right? And this is something that we saw in the very beginning when we were reading through Corinthians. The Corinthians had a kind of hubris about their own knowledge, about their own capabilities of understanding. And Paul is sometimes gently, sometimes very forcefully trying to remind them that knowledge is not enough. Okay? Now, I don't even remember what the next slide was. Yes. What are today's idol foods? We were just talking about this. What, even madar is not doesn't approach what was going on in the Corinthians time and place where they were. So it's that problem is not a problem we face directly today. All right, but this is why I really wanted to study Corinthians with you guys, because I think in our church there are problems that we're facing that are kind of like this. And there's a way that we are being a church which is very similar to the way that the Corinthians were being a church. And here's what I mean. This is from a commentator who's talking about the Corinthians and that kind of the attitude that the Corinthians had towards the church and towards their faith. And he put it this way: that from the Corinthians' point of view, the church, it's not a community, it's not a whole. It's like a club, all right, whose meetings provide important moments of spiritual insight and exaltation, but they don't have a global implication of moral and social change outside of that club. All right? The Corinthians could gladly participate in that church as one segment of their lives, but the segment, however important, is not the whole and the center of their lives. This is the diagnosis of this commentator of the Corinthian church, and sometimes I feel of our church too. Their perception of the church and of the significance of their faith could correlate well with a lifestyle which remained fully integrated in Corinthian society. In other words, they could call themselves Christian, but it would be hard to differentiate them from any other person in the city of Corinth who wasn't a Christian. They were fully integrated otherwise, right? Now, here's what we have to think about in our church. What parts of the outside world are we really integrated with that we shouldn't be? All right? That might even be stumbling blocks to our brothers and sisters inside the church.
Zaven?
Yes.
May I pose the opposite question? What parts of the world outside are we not engaged with as Christians?
Could you repeat that? There was kind of an echo.
I'm sorry. I guess the opposite, the companion question to your question is, what parts of the outside world are we not engaging with as Armenian Christians and should be?
That is the other side of the coin. Now you've doubled the problem, though. This is going to be the Zaven and Kerry.
I mean, Sunday school and language lessons during Badarak is probably one thing that could be a stumbling block.
What do you mean?
Well, it's something that we clearly do for our convenience, right? I mean, in a perfect world, we'd all be worshiping together in liturgy, Badarak, taking communion together, participating in the sacraments in the full life of the church. And we would do some of those other things at different times. So because of the hectic American lifestyle, location, distance, etc., we make a concession there. That's the comment.
And it's a very apropos, because what happens there? People who come to our church, they see, on one floor or one section of the church, some section of the community worshiping. They're in the liturgy. They're participating in the Eucharist. In another section of the church, there are, children who and adults who are not. And actually, that's sanctioned. We're actually are telling them to go and learn Armenian and go to Sunday school, which tells an observer what about our worship time together? Is not as important as learning Ipenkim. That's a problem. That's a problem. And I would say that the idol here that we could be that we could be worshiping there is culture or education, right? Which we put over our faith, over our worship together. What else? Go ahead.
I wanted to focus on the first sentence. The church is not a cohesive community, but a club. To me, I think when I think of a church in time of, especially like early times of apostles, I thought of this close community of worshipers, believers who not only came together for 2 hours, every Sunday, worshipped on their own and then just left, but they were more involved. As a community, they were supporting each other. They were, to some degree, helping each other and in each other's lives. And I think that's something that we may be missing in nowadays church. So yeah, that's one thing that I could think of. The other thing is that, and I'm speaking from my own experience, you have people who come to church, but then when there's a conversation about Christ and who he is and what he demands of us, there's such a not even a pushback. There's this very strange reaction from people. So which makes me understand that Christ, as long as he's someone comfortable to their lives, is fine. But as soon as you start telling people, Christ is not just what we want him to be, but there are certain things that he wants from us. That creates kind of a resentment and pushes people away. So I have noticed that as well. But I don't know how to qualify that, how to interpret that. But this is what I've been noticing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a connection, I think, between what Gohar just said, what you just said, Gohar, and what Yervant was saying a little bit before about people who say, "Oh, that's your truth. That's great that you believe that, Gohar. Good for you. It has nothing to do with me." There's kind of an idolatry of self that detaches someone from that community, from that oneness with each other and with God, because, like earlier in the Bible study we read by Shmiman, who was talking about Lent, that there's a fear that we won't be able to do what we want. When we do God's will, that means we're sacrificing our own, which is true, which is what happens. But the people who fear that don't realize that when we do the will of God, we're doing what is ultimately the best will that we could have for ourselves. The best, when we become what God wants of us, we become the best us that we can become, right? Because he's the one who created us and who gave us our being and our life, and he knows what's best for us. But many people don't understand that, and they're repelled by the idea of having to listen to someone tell them what to do.
That's becoming a larger problem of the leaders, right? Because I think there has to be the leaders need to gather their flock and lead them to a particular direction, ultimately leading them to Christ. So I'm wrestling with that because I want to believe, and I hope that I know Christ enough to know what He wants from us and what He expects us to do and how to behave. And I'm a little puzzled when I see the flock scattered. And anyway, so I'll just stop there.
Well, you brought the issue of the leaders up, which is something that we can discuss a long time. But I wanted to say that we have, all of us, a role in the church because, the leader, let's say, in what Paul is going to describe the church as, a body, the leader might be a prominent part of that body, the head or the eye or something like that. But we are all also parts of the body and have a role in bringing people into the church and in preaching and showing an example of Christian faithfulness and love. We all share in that responsibility. Someone raised a hand. I didn't see who it was.
It's Dean.
Dean.
Yes. And I'm using my cell phone for the sound.
Good.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that's a profound question. Who are the leaders, and where are they leading?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not sort of, well, some have more charisma or some more insight than others, but where do they intend to lead, and where do they intend that they will not be leading us? It's a big question, but I think that's the reason that some people leave. They say, well, where am I being led? And then the question is, if there would be some other leaders, say, hypothetically, who would say, let's have a Bible study, even if we can't all be in the same room. Let's do it over Zoom, and that would be terrific. Will they be supportive and helpful? That would be good, the quote leaders, or will they be off doing something else? So anyway, but I think that's a profound question. People, and sometimes people who are in positions of authority in the organizational chart, proclaim themselves leaders when really nobody or not many people want to follow them. But in any case, it's a profound question for our church.
Well, Mom, did you want to say something? You're on mute now. You have to unmute yourself. Well, the profound question has a profound answer that is just being blocked by mute right now.
Zaven, maybe you can unmute.
No, I just tried. It says I can't unmute her. Well, let's do this. Mom, can you save your comment for next time when we review this part, and come back to this profound question? It's the letters of Paul to the different churches, in particular, church in Corinth and Colossae, and to the church in Rome, are something that I think we have to really pay close attention to. Not only for our individual lives, and there's plenty for us to learn there, but also what we have to do. What can we do together to make our church a better body of Christ? And I think we can do something, and I think we're called to do something as members of the body of Christ. Leaders are people who can be influenced, who can be well, the leaders do the leading, but there's subtle ways that the tail can wag the dog sometimes, right? So that there are ways to influence our leadership as well. And if there's one person that goes to a leader, the leader can often say, well, that's just one person's opinion on or view of the matter. But if many people express the same thing, that person has a harder time denying that that's a pressing concern for the body, for their flock, right? All right. Maybe I'm suggesting something here, but let's continue to talk about that and think about ways that we can make our church less of a club. This is why this quote really got me, because sometimes I see that our church in many ways behaves too much like a club. And that's not what we are. We're a body. We're an organism. We're something much more alive and close together than a club. All right. John Bavarian. Let's get John's comment and then end with a prayer.
Oh, it was just a question.
Oh, okay.
And the question was, when you say something's a club, does that imply people go in order to be served and not disturb each other? Is that the idea?
Yes, that's certainly.
If I were an English gentleman that went to his club, there's people there. I pay a yearly fee. The people there who serve me drinks. Is that the idea?
That's part of the idea. Another part is, and it could fall into the service category, but some people come, just to see their friends, pass some time together, and leave without, with no change, with no edification, with no sense of mission for what they should do in their lives or that day or that week. So a club certainly does provide a place where people can just socialize and pass time and eat delicious foods once in a while, and be served, like you said, delicious foods or served in education or served a cultural event, etc. But is that what we should be expecting from our church? No, it shouldn't. Yes, exactly. It's like Cheers, where everybody knows your name. All right. Okay. I think we have some homework to do. I'm not quite sure what the next step should be in the long term, but in the short term, the next step is let's close with a prayer, and we're going to pray these words, which were about keeping our eyes on God and staying away from idols. But let's also pray for wisdom from God to help us make our church a real live body instead of a club. Okay? Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart is glad in him, because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Zav.
Thank you, Zaven.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
For everyone who joined, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Everyone will be hungry for meat by then.
Good
Bye.
night.
Bye.